Hi, my name is Steve Copeland and welcome to this series on foundational theology. In this video, I want to give an introduction on the issue of original sin, the issues and implications. In the year 396, about 360 years after the resurrection of Christ, the Latin theologian Augustine of Hippo introduced a radical departure from early church theology with his doctrine of original sin. That doctrine misinterpreted Romans 5:12 to mean that all human beings sinned in Adam, and therefore inherited the sin, guilt, and wrath of God as if we had committed that sin ourselves in the Garden of Eden. Now, this is called the federal view of original sin, the idea that Adam, as the head of the human race, passed all of his sin and guilt onto all who followed him. Up to this point in church history, theology was discussed between two distinct groups: Latin theologians such as Origen, Tertullian, and Augustine, and Greek theologians such as Irenaeus, Justin, Gregory Nazianzus, and others. The Latin theologians, generally speaking, used a Latin version of the scripture known as the Vulgate, and the Greek theologians used the original or copies of the Greek manuscripts. By the time that Augustine became influential, the church had already joined the Roman Empire in about the year 314, and the whole process of the papacy was forming. Augustine's version of original sin became the new explanation adopted by the now Roman Catholic Church, and anyone who opposed it was labeled as a heretic. Thus, Augustine's original sin became the traditional view, and few people have ever been taught the early church view of what happened in Eden, or what we actually inherited from Adam. So why should the writings of the earliest theologians, such as Irenaeus and Justin, hold more authority as accurate interpretations of Scripture than Augustine, apart from the fact that they were Greek-speaking and Greek writing? Well, firstly, we know that Irenaeus was trained by Polycarp, the man who was martyred in his 80s before a Roman crowd. Polycarp was a personal friend of the Apostle John, and John's theology is the most developed in any of the Gospels. If anyone understood how the apostles interpreted their own inspired scripture, it was Polycarp, because he knew John personally, and he may have even known the Apostle Paul. And he passed this theology on to Irenaeus, who was one of his students, and likely Justin as well. And as we will see, when we read their theology regarding Christ, the wording is so incredibly familiar, as if they are repeating the language of the same teacher. Now you may ask, why is all this so important? Well, there are many incredibly important reasons why we must get this right. And in my opinion, we must reject Augustine's idea and re-adopt the theology of Scripture as interpreted by Christianity's earliest theologians. For example, the immediate question became, how did Jesus in his human nature escape this original sin? This was the problem that Augustine and his followers had. Now, various ideas were put forward, including that sin was only passed through the male's seed, and since Jesus had no human father, he avoided it. However, the scriptures clearly state that Jesus inherited the same genome as David, and Romans 1:3, for example, even uses the term, or at least the word, spermatikos, to describe this. This is a word meaning from which we take seed, semen, etc. So it was obvious that Jesus inherited David's genes through his mother Mary. Now maybe Augustine missed this because of the fact that he did not know Greek, and he only used the Latin Vulgate version. So the Roman Catholic answer to this dilemma was to invent a doctrine called the Immaculate Conception, the false claim that Mary never contracted this original sin, therefore she couldn't have passed it on to Jesus. Now, this led to the idea that Mary never sinned in her entire life, that she remained a virgin, and therefore, as a sinless saint, she could be prayed to, she could be worshipped, and that she intercedes for Christians. For Roman Catholics and other denominations that adopted this view, she is the Mother of God. She is the Queen of Heaven. Any person or group who refuted these views throughout the medieval period was labelled a heretic and murdered by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, we could also trace the practice of infant baptism, venerating saints and superstitions, the power of relics, bones, teeth, or other parts of dead saints, purgatory, and the murder of witches, to the list of fruit from this doctrine of Augustine on original sin. They all have their roots in this doctrine. In my opinion, any doctrine must be evaluated not only on its absolute support from Scripture, but also on the fruit that it produces. And the fruit of Augustine's doctrine of inherited sin and guilt is rotten to the core. But perhaps the most serious fruit of this doctrine is in creating a Jesus with a completely different human nature to our own, a doctrine which is absolutely refuted in Scripture and by the earliest Christian theologians for one simple reason. If Christ was not, quote, made like his brothers in every way, as Hebrews 2:17 states, then he cannot make atonement for sin, and he cannot be a fit substitute for us because he is not like us. This heresy is the heart of Docetism, one of the first major heresies to attack Christianity, and yet versions of it are taught in Calvinism, in Roman Catholicism, and many evangelical denominations all over the world today. What we lay as the foundation of our theology will determine everything that is built upon that foundation. If the foundation is wrong, it will affect every part of the structure. Now, over the next few weeks, I will be making several videos which will be addressing all of the issues regarding theological foundations and presenting the views of the earliest Christian theologians, those who used the original Greek and were the first to receive what was handed down by the apostles. Friends, their theology utterly contradicts Augustine's views in the extreme, and unlike Augustine, who adopted his ideas, these theologians can fit all of Scripture into their theology without contradiction, or without adding heretical views, ideas, and practices. It is for this reason that the subtitle of my practical systematic theology textbook is Reclaiming the Doctrine of the Early Church, and why I've added over 70 quotes from these men. I want students to understand what the church was teaching before Augustine introduced these ideas. So I invite you, pastors, theologians, Bible study leaders, seminary lecturers, and any who love Christ and love right theology to watch the videos and critique the theological claims being made in them. So in the videos that I'll be uploading over the next few weeks, we will take a systematic approach along the lines of the following. Number 1, what was God's purpose in creating us, and what is the end goal? More specifically, why were we made in God's image? Does the image still remain? Can the inherent nature of a creature be lost or changed? Why were we made a little lower than the angels and crowned with glory and honor? Also, what did the early church fathers mean by the term deification and becoming? Number 2, what motivated this first act of rebellion in the Garden of Eden? Now, everybody is happy to just throw original sin onto everything that happened later, but we need to talk about what happened and what motivated the first sin. Was it a desire to be like God? A desire for knowledge? A desire for perfection and even independence and autonomy? If God is the ultimate and absolute perfect manifestation of perfection, knowledge, and autonomy, being a law unto himself, and we are made in his image, then would this explain our desire for perfection, knowledge, and autonomy? Number 3, the human nature of Christ. What do we mean by the term sin nature, a term translated from the Greek word sarx, which simply means flesh? Why are there over a dozen verses which state that Jesus had the exact same sarx as ours? But when we translate these words, we use flesh instead of sinful nature. Is this a classic example of interpreting according to tradition rather than the teaching of Scripture, and ultimately presenting a Doctrinus Christ? And by the way, the old King James Version never uses the term sinful nature, but always translates sarx as flesh, and the new versions of the NIV are going back to that. So how did the earliest theologians interpret Scripture in regards to what we inherited from Adam? What did they mean by the term corruption? And why is their theology so important in terms of salvation? Number 4, what must be submitted to Christ in order to begin this process of deification, in order to be born again? And what does it mean to be finally crowned with glory and honor? What is the sin principle which must be crucified with Christ? Number 5, how does a biblical foundation answer the problem of evil and suffering? Was it actually necessary to allow evil in the world? And what place does evil play in the purpose and goal of creation? Now we may well ask, okay, what difference does it make if our desire for independence is grounded in God's image or an inherited guilt-sin nature, for the result is we all sin anyway? The difference is incredibly important in how we understand the goal of creation, salvation, the nature of Jesus, and the character of God. If we believe that we are born innocent, that God desires all to be saved, that Jesus had the same human nature to our own, and that all human beings under God's grace and leading have the opportunity for salvation, then this is the way that we will present the gospel and the heart of God. However, if we believe that we haven't inherited the sin and guilt of Adam, that we are all equally, totally depraved, then we end up with Christ having a different human nature to our own, and all of the implications of that heresy, that there's no freedom of the will, a doctrine of double predestination, and no adequate answer as to why God created or who created evil, or why the gospel is needed at all. Because, dear friends, if you're predetermined to heaven or hell, the gospel simply isn't necessary. In other words, if God foreordained the vast majority of humans to eternal hell by virtue of one man's sin, what kind of God does this portray? Furthermore, is this the way that God is portrayed in Scripture? This is what is at stake with these issues. If we get this wrong, how can we explain then Jesus healing every person who came to him, or embracing children and blessing them, or even the need for him to give his life on the cross? If there is no human freedom, there is no real love. Sin is preordained, creation was needless, and even the cross itself is a farce. The concept of original sin or inherited sin guilt is completely absent in the writings of the early church fathers prior to Augustine. Writers such as Justin and Irenaeus speak of corruption, and they use the word fate rather than predetermined, and refute the idea that we are all fated to either heaven or hell. But let's be clear. In his earlier writings, such as On Free Will, which both Pelagius and Julian of Eclanum appeal to, Augustine held very similar views regarding sin as Irenaeus and Justin. Most people don't even know this. But he changed his views around the year 396 AD. Both Irenaeus and Justin claim that all men are born with the same nature and have the power to choose either good or evil, as in this following quote from Irenaeus. But if some have been made by nature bad and others good, these latter would not be deserving of praise for being good, for such were they created, nor would they be reprehensible, for thus they were made originally. But since all men are of the same nature, able to both hold fast and to do what is good, and on the other hand, having also the power to cast good away from them and not do it, some do justly receive praise even among men who are under the control of good laws, and much more from God, and obtain deserved testimony of their choice of good in general, and of persevering therein. but the others are blamed and receive a just condemnation because of their rejection of what is fair and good. This is Irenaeus Against Heresies, Book 4 and Chapter 37. Irenaeus is absolutely convinced that all men are of the same nature, able to hold fast to what is good and have the power to cast good away. His reasons for claiming this are tied to the fact of just punishment, and that God punishes us according to our actions, and not to some idea that we've been born sinners who have no choice but to sin. This is not a Pelagian view, which posits the idea that a person can lead a perfect life, for such a thought is also totally absent in the writings of Justin and Irenaeus and any of the early church fathers. In fact, it's doubtful that Pelagius ever taught such a thing. Rather, Justin and Irenaeus, both theologians, come at the issue from the position that Adam and Eve were mere infants driven by the desire to become like God and deceived into believing they could achieve this independent of God. This is how they present the idea of original sin or original corruption. In the next video, we're going to examine the question of why we were created in God's image and likeness. Now, this series of videos I will place in a new playlist entitled Foundational Theology to set it apart from the topical videos that I've been doing. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your comments, and God bless.